Pathway Therapy Conversations. Here we talk about what most therapists only whisper about. But here we speak on the topics we've been conditioned to stay quiet about, the ones that rock the boat. But here, nope, we're not protecting the silence anymore. We're breaking it. So let's own it. Happy February, I should say. And this is actually my first episode for this year for Your Own Pathway Therapy Conversations. Because I'm going to be honest, there has been a lot going on at the beginning of the year. And for those who have not had a chance to watch some of the other episodes that I put out this year, you may or may not know, but I currently live in a city where there is ICE occupation, and because of that, there's just been so many things going on internally, externally, which has really impacted a lot of us living here internally. So I've been very mindful and trying to be present. And, as therapists, we all know the importance of being present and also taking care of ourselves, especially in these times of harm, systematic trauma, institutional trauma. And so this is my first episode for Therapy Conversations, and I am happy to be back. And I also wanted to say again, this episode feels important right now. It does too. And I've actually wanted to do this episode for a while, but because of everything going on, again, like I said, I've just been very mindful of how I'm feeling and also reading the room of when is appropriate to do content and when it's not. So just wanted to say a few of those things right now before we do this episode. And through all of this, there's been a lot of outspoken people who have made valid points, and then there are people who have been silent. And then there's also been people with huge platforms that have said things that you're just like, okay, like that doesn't make sense. And this episode today talks about that group where you're just kind of like, well, this is why it's so important to have people who actually do our work be the ones speaking out. And I'm talking about the wellness and pop psychology influencers who are making posts, especially later in January when there was the second murder of Alex Preddy. And yes, I said the word murder. I don't know if YouTube is going to ding me on this or not, probably, but I'm going to say it anyway. And um, I want to say that I'm not here to drag any of the pop psychologists, even though it sounds like I'm doing that. A lot of pop of the psychology influencers were posting guidance and posting motivation. And I'm not here to screenshot or to drag anyone. But what struck me was the response that these big wellness gurus and influencers, how they were responding. And, the thing was actually, even though they have such a large following, a lot of people also push back on the responses that said to them, well, that response really didn't land. And some people even said, like, you're not trauma informed to see these things. And not that you have to be trauma informed to show empathy, but sometimes the responses from these wellness influencers and pop psychology was so out there that people are like, really, you're you're putting this stuff out. And a lot of, some of them were saying, oh, just practice mindfulness, or just shift your mindset, or make sure you regulate harder, or it's okay to just let things go. And a lot of this felt very disconnected, and mostly it felt very privileged and very unrealistic, especially for people who are actually living through this, especially for the people who live here in the state of Minnesota, and especially in the Twin Cities, and especially being a immigrant and person of color, because ICE, were not just going for immigrants, they were going for anybody who opposed them and anybody who looked different. And so for influencers to say all this, it just felt real unrealistic, and from safety and privilege. And so in these moments, I think that a lot of people are starting to see what pop psychology is all about. And they're really starting to see the limits of pop psychology, especially coming from the wellness influencer. And so I want to remind that this episode is not about hate. It's not about jealousy. It's not about women hating other women or women tearing other women down, because I've had people say, well, you're a woman. Why are you tearing down other women? It is not about that. I feel that, as therapists, especially in this field, we know that being challenged is part of the field, and being challenged and explaining why you feel the way you do is important, instead of just saying, well, this person's a woman and the fact that you are critiquing them work means that you don't support women. No, I support women. However, if there is something that a woman says or does that I don't agree with, or that I want to learn more about it, I will question. And this is actually about scope, it's about training, it's about harm, it's about reducing harm. And this is why I think a lot of us, I don't want to speak for all of us, but this is why a lot of us don't trust pop psychology. S- And so there's three people today that I actually want to focus on. And some of these people are probably, the audience are probably, well, why are you comparing this person? This person has the background, the framework, and everything. And I will explain all of that in the episode. So, without further ado, let's get right into it. All right, let's get to everybody's favorite wellness pop psychologist, wellness influencer, Mel Robbins. Now, I know I'm going to get a lot of hate for this one, which I welcome the hate. And I'm going to explain why a lot of us are pushing against like Mel Robbins. So, first of all, Mel Robbins is not a trained therapist. She's actually an attorney by trade, by training. And that distinction matters, because what is happening would be like us, like as a therapist, like me. Can you imagine us therapists walking into the legal profession and inventing legal frameworks and telling lawyers how to practice law? That's her framework of let them. Let them is very marketable, don't get me wrong, and it's really sticky, like, it sticks people's legs, like, let them. But clinically, though, let them raises a lot of red flags, especially for, someone with a trauma, with attachment wounds, or chronic self-abandonment. The theory of letting them can reinforce harm rather than empowerment. Because trauma informed work asks, is this boundary setting or is this actually avoidance? Is this safety or is this shutting down? And whose advice does this actually protect? So, when frameworks are created without trauma training, attachment theory, or harm reduction understanding, they default to the worldview of the most resource audience. And unfortunately, that's how harm happens. Not maliciously. I don't think Mel's intention is to be malicious. However, when not clinically and trauma trained, and you say, let them, just let them, it may actually cause more harm than good. And unfortunately, that's how harm happens and perpetuates. It's not maliciously, but very predictable. And so I gotta be honest, I have not read any of her books, especially Let Them. I know that her work is very highly recommended from other therapists. I mean, if that's you, kudos to you, but I honestly, I don't feel the need to read it. So that's Mel Robbins, going with the let them theory. And I know that a lot of therapists have actually started challenging Mel and her let them theory. And not just therapists, but other people have really started calling Mel out on her let them let them, and especially during the holidays when it was like, oh Mel, should I just let my abusive parents do this? Should I just let them? And so there's a lot of people who are speaking out about Mel and her let them theory. All right, so let's talk about the next person. And this person has mixed reviews, and this person is Jay Shetty, which he represents something different. He is a very gifted storyteller. His spiritual framing comes from moral authority. And yes, there has been public questions about his background and his credibility. And in this episode, I'm not here to do that. If you want to, you can definitely look, but there has been questions about his credibility. And clinically, I had to take a pause there. I'm like, how do I want to say this? Clinically, here's the issue with Jay. When story becomes the credential, authority goes unquestioned. And with him, his spiritual language can create meaning, but meaning is not treatment. And the thing about this is, he's all about, his story was that he was a monk and he brought a lot of that wisdom with him to sell his story, in which there has been pushback about his credibility. And he is all about, meditation and mindfulness. The thing is, yes, that's important. However, you cannot meditate your way out of trauma. You cannot mindset your way through a dysregulated nervous system shaped by chronic threat. When simplicity replaces clinical depth, people who don't heal, people don't heal through insight alone. And this can begin to feel very defective. And that's not healing. So that's with Jay Shetty. And I want to next bring how Jay and Mel have such huge platforms and how this impacts um, pop psychology here. So, as I mentioned, that Mel and Jay have huge platforms. They have huge platforms, they both have podcasts, and they have huge people, huge like celebrities, very, very well known people on their podcasts. And they talk about mental health, which, okay, I think it's okay to talk about mental health. But here is where the concern is um they talk about vulnerability, and their vulnerability, the mental health becomes a conversation. And the conversations around vulnerability are good, but holding vulnerability is not the same as treating vulnerability. When diagnostic language and emotional processing are discussed without containment, assessment, or accountability, vulnerability becomes performance. And so when you're a listener and you're not a trained therapist, which of course we don't expect everybody to be a trained therapist. So oftentimes, because they have such huge platforms, listeners compare themselves. Listeners may compare themselves, and in doing so, they may minimize themselves or assume that they're failing if quick insight doesn't fix deep wounds that they have. Because these people are looking for resources, resources, and the vulnerability and, the guests, the things that they talk about, it's human, and the whole point of these, podcast episodes is to see the human side of these huge celebrities and important people, and so when they talk about these things, like, compare themselves and say, "You know what? Michelle Obama," or, oh gosh, who's also been on there, I'm trying to think, like, who's the, Emma from, Harry Potter books are in there, like, I think she went on Jay Shetty and talked about all these things and compared their story to the celebrities, and it's like, "You know what? I don't have um, quick insight, or I don't have the deep fix to these wounds. What's wrong with me?" And unfortunately, that's not empowerment. This person, I know that I'm going to get a lot of pushback because people love her. And I get it. She is the go to person, especially when it comes about vulnerability, which we've been talking about. And vulnerability, the go to person has been Brene Brown. And people are going to be like, why are you including Brene? Look, I'm going to explain why I included Brene here. So Brene is more complicated. She's not your typical wellness influencer, pop psychology. Her background is that she does hold a PhD in social work, and her work is research based, not clinical based. So Brene brought shame and vulnerability into mainstream conversations. And of course, that matters. But her training is research focused, not clinical based practice. And this matters because research and therapy are connected, but they are not interchangeable. And so her vulnerability framework circulates largely within affluent, educated, mostly white corporate networks. And her work in vulnerability is protected and resourced and very much rewarded. So when she shares about imperfection, she gains influence. And I wanted to share this. Like, I was talking to somebody and we kind of joked about this. This person was like, "Oh yeah, Brene Brown is the go-to for corporations, like corporate speakers, because she's like the go-to for white women, and then women talk to their husbands, and their husbands like, oh yeah, we should have someone to come talk to our corporations about vulnerability." And so Brene is the go-to. And so her research has also been, people, for therapists, we've all taken research classes we've all taken research. And one of the things we talk about our limitations is who our sample base is. And her sample for a lot of her work is very affluent, upper class, educated, suburban white people. And so that has been the pushback about her work. And that's why I brought Brene in, because Brene is now the go to, the guru for vulnerability and just saying, oh, it's okay to show your vulnerability because that shows the human side of you. And people will thank you, and you will thank you for showing that soft, vulnerable side of you. And so, with everything going on in the world, and I decided to watch the Netflix special on Michelle Obama becoming, which is a little older, but I haven't had a chance to watch it. And when I did, Michelle talked about vulnerability too. And that got me thinking, Michelle Obama is a very well-known, former first lady of the United States and a black woman. And she was talking about vulnerability and how, it's okay to show vulnerability. And I gotta be honest, when I heard that, I'm like, Michelle Obama talked about vulnerability. But then I realized a few things about Michelle's vulnerability versus Brene Brown's vulnerability. And Michelle spoke about vulnerability and becoming after 8 years of racialized scrutiny, political attacks, and constant surveillance. And during those 8 years, if she had shown any emotional vulnerability during that time, oh, it would have been weaponized. It would have been weaponized against her, especially from the critics and especially from the right wingers. Yes, I'm saying that. So, what she had to do though during those 8 years was she had to practice containment, not because she lacked humanity, but because she needed survival. And only after she was out of the White House, where she was not scrutinized, was she able to show vulnerability. And her vulnerability came after power, after protection. And so that is the difference between what Brene teaches, vulnerability from safety, and what Michelle Obama practiced. Because she didn't get to practice vulnerability until after earning her safety. And so the thing is, not everyone gets grace at first. And the core issue here isn't about intention. It's about influence without containment. So when influence moves faster than nuance, that is when the harm spreads. And therapists, we are trained in containment. We're trained to ask, who is this actually safe for? Who might this harm? And what context is actually missing from all of this? What power dynamics are being ignored? And so this is why therapists, us, we're often skeptical of pop psychology. Because the thing is, without inspiration, without containment, it can unintentionally create harm. And lastly, I want to, bring this comparison. You hear me talk about Mel, Jay, Brene, and when I think about influencers, I think about the analogy of like a Michelin trained chef versus a food influencer. And I want to again say that there's nothing wrong with being food influencers. They can be inspiring, entertaining, and very accessible, of course, and definitely have their own opinions and have a lot of influence. But the thing is, watching someone cook on Instagram and review food on Instagram is not the same as dining at a Michelin star restaurant or being a Michelin star chef. A Michelin star chef, trains for years. They understand technique, chemistry, sourcing, and safety. So they carry liability and accountability for their craft and their work. And their work is bound by standards. Food influencers, on the other hand, share recipes, which is perfectly fine. Sometimes they offer shortcuts and make things look simple. They are optimized for visibility and reach. But both the influencer and the Michelin staff operate in the food world. However, they are not the same, and this is where the distinction matters. When we look at personalities like Mel Robbins and Jay Shetty, and even the more research based, grounded mass position like Brene Brown is, they function more like food influencers than Michelin trained chefs because they simplify, they package, they translate, they scale. Therapists, on the other hand, we are trained to sit with complexity, assess risk, understand trauma, recognize when something is being contradicted, And most importantly, we protect the client, not the brand, and we assess for harm. And the ultimate goal for us is to reduce harm. To reduce harm, not create harm. And that is a difference. The difference is not popularity, it is responsibility. So, influencers can advise and feel empowering. Clinical work, on the other hand, is accountable. And when the topic is trauma, attachment, abuse, depression, anxiety, which some people have said, oh, it's not real. It's anxiety is very real. Moral injury or nervous system collapsing. This distinction stops being aesthetic and starts being ethical and clinical. I mean, you wouldn't want a food influencer performing surgery in a commercial kitchen, right? I just want to preface again that therapists are upset because influencers are popular. We're concerned because the public often can't tell the difference between inspiration and intervention. So, I know that this episode is going to have mixed reaction, and that's perfectly fine. And if you have any concerns, watching this episode, and then you're a therapist, have any concerns that you would like to add, please put down in the comment section. But that is all I have for everyone today. And it is nice to be back. And I hope everybody, especially people who do this, feel please take care of yourself. Please be mindful. Please, really stay safe and take care of you. So, again, this is your own pathway therapy conversations where, again, we're no longer silent and we own it. So, take care, and I'll see you all next time. Bye.